Hello and welcome to Bright Wings, children's books to make the heart soar. I am your host, Charity Hill. The purpose of this conversation is to help mothers and fathers identify books that will liberate their children to embrace truth, goodness, and beauty. In this podcast, I continue my conversation with Julian Peters, the comic artist of the poetic anthology Poems to See By, where Mr. Peters visually interprets great poetry. In this episode, we discuss the images that Julian provided for the poem Those Winter Sundays, and we continue to ponder the relationship between comics and beauty. He also offers some comments about the suitability or not of adapting certain classic works into graphic novels. I wonder if we could talk about the images in Those Winter Sundays, the poem by Robert Hayden.
Yeah.
Again, just a reminder for our listeners that you can find these images in a link in the show notes. I think you're going to want to see what we're talking about. Okay, earlier, Julian, in the previous podcast, we were talking about the ability for comics to allow for rest. Yeah. The rest that's kind of, I think, inherent in beauty. And I just noticed that the first panel of this is kind of purple-blue and has no images, just the words. And therefore, as this moment of rest as the poem is beginning.
It has no images, but I'm already trying to suggest an early morning because the blue, this bluish color fades to a white at the bottom, and it kind of looks a little bit like a maybe a gray morning, a little bit of light on the horizon.
Yeah, and cold. For me, it emphasized the cold that is talked about in the poem. So it's a poem for our listeners, in case you haven't read it. It's a poem about a boy and his father, and his father's fidelity to rising early and making the house warm, and how no one ever thanked him. That's the basic narrative. So I'm just going to read it. Julian. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices?
I like your pacing.
Thanks. In the panels, the first color to be introduced after that kind of blue-purple, the figures are drawn in black, and then the first color kind of to be introduced other than that is the coals are kind of rosy, and then the fire blazes up. We see the father getting dressed, and then the warm color begins to invade the cool color.
Mm-hmm.
And then what an insightful way to depict the father, a stained glass window in one of the middle panels. Actually, it's the third panel from the end of the poem. You depicted the father kind of like in a stained glass window, and he's stoking the fires to warm the house, honoring him for his goodness, for his love in a way that's associated religiously. We usually think of stained glass windows as being associated with people who are famous, who have done great deeds. But here you're associating those great deeds with these small, loving actions that are hidden, that have gone unrecognized and unthanked with this stained glass window. So I loved that. I thought that was such an insightful way to show the truth of what the father was doing, of the fact of his love in his acts of service. And then in the last panel, the grown-up boy, who's now a father, and his son are looking the father's grave, but in a certain sense, it's like a statue of honor. And the statue of honor that you gave him was the father is holding a shoe that he's polished for the boy.
Right. Yeah. So there's a little motif there in the panels where the father is depicted doing these kind of thankless tasks, right, of fatherly by the son at the time. So there's sort of mundane activities like getting dressed really early in the morning with his kind of, you see his back kind of curved over by the strain. He's been working all week and he has to get up early on Sunday too to light the coals. Then he's lighting up the coal fire and then polishing the shoes. But each of these mundane acts is depicted in a context where you would depict something that you're kind of trying to elevate or honor. So like a fancy frame on a mantelpiece in the first one, and then the stained glass window, of course, and the funerary monument that you would have in like some grand tomb where you have some, mourning angel like you'd see maybe in New Orleans. But here it's the marble statue of the father polishing his shoes. And in terms of the color, yeah, that's very true that it's built about those two. It's built around those two colors that represent. The blue represents the coldness, both the physical coldness in the house and maybe an emotional coldness between father and son. And the red instead is the warmth that is being generated, the warmth of the father's love as well. And the last panel is in purple, which is basically literally just taking those two colors that I was working with and mixing them together. And I think it...
Of course. Good. Oh, thank you.
It's like, I think I see it as representing a kind of more integrated vision of your father as an adult, right? He's brought the things together. The grown-up son now is looking back and seeing things more wholly, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. Marvelous. Thank you for helping me to see more than my own insights into your work. It's really exciting to hear you talk about it. Julian, I wonder if we could turn from your work into the question of other comic artists. I think my listeners are hoping that I will tell them what to read and what not to read in the comic genre, like what's worth reading and what isn't. And I'm at a loss because I'm just only a beginner. Do you have favorites within the genre, Julian?
Oh, well, I definitely do. But it's such a vast genre, right? That I've been reading all my life.
Yeah.
I grew up mainly with Italian comics, as I said, which are, I think, my favorite comics. I think they're the greatest comics tradition for me, anyway. But also a lot of French comics because I was growing up in a French-speaking city, and France has an incredible comics tradition as well. And then, of course, the whole Anglophone world, which in recent years has really exploded. Right? Comics have become much more culturally legitimated in North America, and you've really seen an explosion of comics covering all kinds of subjects in all directions. Yeah, I think for any tastes, there's a comic that will cater to it.
I wonder if you know Gareth Hines and his work. He's illustrated the Iliad and the Odyssey, Macbeth, King Lear, illustrated and interpreted, right?
Yeah, well, no, I do know him, and actually, he was very kind enough to leave a little blurb, I guess, about the book, because he's really, he's a major figure in the classic adaptation into comics. Beautiful.
So he's the first one after you who kind of caught my attention, who does this work.
And I should say, I guess again, in Europe, there's such a long tradition, as I was saying, of adapting. Like I've read many versions, I think, of like extracts from the Iliad or Edgar Allan Poe in Italian. But in North America, he's really a pioneer of that. Although there is also this, I sometimes hear people reference classic comics, which was a series of comics, I think it came out in the 60s, and a lot of, I guess, more baby boomers have cherished memories of reading these when they were kids. And they were presenting, they had like all those classic Homer and Shakespeare and so on, Edgar Allan Poe in comic, but very much in like that sort of classic American comic form, maybe like what you were thinking of with this sort of a bit like generic depictions of style, very comic stylized kind of.
Okay. Okay. I wonder what you would have to say. Are you familiar with the Magic Treehouse series written by Mary Pope Osborne, or the
No, I don't.
largely for girls series called The Babysitter's Club?
Oh, yes, yes. I read a few copies. My sister was a big fan. And
Attaboy. So I've heard that they are making those into graphic novels.
oh, really?
And I wonder what the point is.
Hmm. That's an interesting question. Because so much great literature now is being adapted into comics. Like I saw there's a recent version of The Great Gatsby in comic book form. And yeah, I'm not sure if it always works that well. Sometimes it really does. I think where the comics really bring out something, like I'm thinking if you're illustrating Homeric myths like Iliad or something like that, I think it's told traditionally in such a different way than comics, that I think the comic book retelling would really lead you to see it in a different way. Or I also have Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung, right, that the operas are based on in comics form.
Wow.
And that is pretty incredible because it's illustrated by these established Marvel comics artists, so drawing it in that superhero style with the bulging muscles and the very garish colors, but it actually really works well with the sort of Wagnerian universe because it is also very over the top like that. And so it kind of brings out that element of it.
Who does that? Who has done that? Do you know?
Well, I'm going to say maybe from the 90s. I have it here, but I'll have to go look in my bookshelf and find it. So it's not a recent, it kind of predates this tendency now where everything is being turned into comics. So it was kind of a work. But something like The Great Gatsby, I'm not sure if it would translate well because so much of what works in novels is the beauty of the language, right? The evocative imagery that I think you can't really capture in the same way.
You can't make everything into an image.
Yeah.
That way.
I don't know. I do feel like it might end up being a bit redundant. There's it's sort of like analogous to when you adapt a novel to film, right? Like, I mean, I think, it's rarely like completely satisfactory.
Yes.
There's something I think though with film, there's almost something just sort of like a primal kind of pleasure in seeing these things brought to life so literally in a way, or like seeing the actors actually say the lines that you read, but it's not usually like high art. But in comics, you wouldn't really have that aspect either, because it would still be like an abstraction of reality. So it would just be another way of retelling the original story. But yeah, I think it's not necessarily the best. But there are stories that are written to be comics that is probably the best way to tell them. Maybe the most famous graphic novel of all time is Mouse by Art Spiegelman, American graphic novel, which first came out in 93, I think. And that's it's a story of his father's experience in the Holocaust. Very, very grim and not the subject matter that you would have expected could be treated through comics, especially in North America, where comics have always been associated with comedy or superheroes. But it really is very, very powerful. And the central metaphor that he uses of depicting the Jewish people as mice works very well, I think, because it creates this slight abstraction of reality where you're not depicting things completely literally, because obviously the human beings are mice and the Germans are depicted as cats. So because it's not an attempt at a literal depiction of reality, I think your mind has to complete what the actual horror would have been. It kind of allows your imagination to be engaged, I think, in a different way. that you wouldn't have in a more explicit movie.
Yes. Yes.
So it works a little bit like the way a novel works too, because your mind has to complete it or engage with the words and create the story in your mind. I think comics have that power as well, when they're not just attempting to literally depict things.
Yeah. So there's ways in which comics can ask more of their audience, of their viewer, that asks them to engage their imagination, to kind of incarnate in their minds with the images and the words something new.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then sometimes it's just excessive. It does do the thinking for you, I think. That's my concern sometimes with this notion that they're turning the Babysitter's Club books into graphic novel. I just think, like, what can that really add? Like, these books are very accessible. It's very easy to create these images for themselves. I'm not sure that it's going to add something profound.
Yeah, it seems more like, I would be more wary of something like that. Like, you could maybe create an analogous kind of story, like something like the Babysitter's Club that was conceived as a comic. To adapt something like that, it does seem a little redundant.
Yeah.
But it is, like, to me, I don't know, I guess it is, like, because I started doing it so young, it does seem like a very instinctive form of storytelling, comics. Like, I mean, it's funny to say that it's instinctive, because it's a genre that's only existed for about 100 years, I think. So I guess it's not as natural as it feels maybe when you're raised in it. But yeah, I remember as a kid, I really loved reading comics, and I also loved reading books. And it was two different things, but they were probably pleasures that were analogous in some ways, and they each have their own advantages. They're certainly more immersive than staring at a screen anyway, right? Like,
yes. This is funny, perhaps to you as a Canadian, but for me, Anne of Green Gables was a kind of sacred text. And so I was very annoyed that she'd been made into a graphic novel.
And I think she's also been made into Japanese animation.
Really? Weird.
Really, really popular in Japan, strangely. Yeah, very strange. There was a period anyway where apparently Japanese tourists were just lining up, to get into the Anne of Green Gables home.
That's marvelous. That redhead, she's universally lovable, and yet, so for me, I'm like, how can you take this very important book, this semi-sacred text, and do something to it? It's like if they made a movie of her and got her all wrong. That would be my fear of turning Anne of Green Gables into a graphic novel. That even in Anne's own terms, a graphic novel of that work would leave too little scope for the imagination.
Yeah.
I suspect that, for me, I always want to get back to the original text. So for some of these where books have been turned into graphic novels, when it has been a point where sometimes it gives an entry point so that the child can then feel like, oh, hey, I can do this. I can read this great book. It helps me to know that I'm capable of these thoughts. Engagement with this text. I can do this. And therefore I can go back to the original. So when it's an entry point to going back to the original, if it can be that for a child, I think that's good. Does it happen? I'm not sure. Would it happen in a house where graphic novels are competing with screens? I don't know.
Yeah, like, I feel like graphic novels are more analogous to the world of printed books anyway than to the world of screens. Like, so if you're getting your child into reading comics, I feel like it's sending them in the right direction if you want them to read printed books later. That thing that you were saying about the comics versions of literature, now that I think of it, also I was reading a lot of these Italian Disney comics when I was a kid, because Disney comics are huge in Italy. It's actually the country that publishes the most Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse comics in the world, or at least it was in those days. And they used to have all these reductions of great works of literature told as they were like duck stories or mouse stories. So you would have like War and Peace and
No way.
Les Miserables and like all these classic. You'd also have like Iliad and stuff, but all told in a kind of or Dante's Inferno, but all like told through the duck characters and the mouse characters, and like some great works of literature I still have never read, but I have a vague idea of them because of this.
Don't say that.
It's great at a cocktail party. You can sort of coast. But I think that does like maybe it like at least makes that world a little bit familiar to the kid. Like I feel like maybe you never read War and Peace, but you sort of know that it's set in the Napoleonic Wars, and there's like a love story and Natasha and so on. It might already give the sense to the kid, to the child, that it's not an alien world, that it's somehow a place that he or she could kind of immerse themselves in one day, like it's not foreign territory. So I think that could be useful in that sense. I mean, there's also like some people were complaining that even some children's books are not going to lead children to read great works of literature, right? There was a polemic about whether Harry Potter will lead children to a lifelong love of great literature or just to read pulp books later. And I think it can only help.
Yeah, I hope so. I don't know. That's such an interesting question, right? To point them to the lasting things and how to do that. That's what this conversation was for, is to try to think about that some more, how to point them towards beauty and truth and deep engagement with reality, thoughtful engagement with reality. This author called Scott McCloud, who wrote Understanding Comics, he really helped me to emerge from my bubble, as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast a little bit, and see that there are things of value in comics. He argues too that there's a long tradition, that the Egyptian hieroglyphics, the pre-Columbians had long screens, that the Bayeux tapestry, these are all comics, actually. And he calls it sequential art.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I just think that it's good to know that there's such a history to comics, that people have been making comics for much of human history.
Yeah.
There's still a need to do it today. There's still a need to do it in a thoughtful way today, in a beautiful way today, in a way that creates more sustained reflection between the reader or the viewer. I guess you read a picture too, as well as you read the words.
Yeah. They're usually called comics readers. That's true. That's an interesting. I guess it does seem to go more towards being treated as literature than as visual art.
And so, I think that what you're doing is so important. And I hope you have plans to do more of it, Julian. Do you have?
I would like to.
Plans to perhaps illustrate more poetry or something else?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I don't think I have any particular. I did a couple of poems even after this book came out, but it would be nice to do another book length project. There's so many different styles in this book, and I think the different visual approaches comes from wanting to find the particular style that matches the poem for me. But it's also a little bit of a sense of, I think, constant dissatisfaction with what I've done, always wanting to get a little bit closer to what I feel like I would be my objective with this. So I always see it as like a challenge that's constantly renewed, I guess. Like every time I try to adapt a poem is, how can I make this a more immersive experience? How can I really make words and image come together? Or how can I achieve some of that same power, emotional power in the poem through images or through the interaction of image and poem? I think in a way, like it's kind of a losing battle, because I don't think visual art has the same. I mean, it's very important to me. It's very powerful, but I don't think it can achieve quite the same amount of emotional resonance as the written word. So there's sort of something beautiful about that challenge, to struggle against that limitation, try to overcome it as much as possible, I guess, without ever entirely achieving it.
No, I wonder if writers think the exact opposite of you. If writers think, oh, those who make images can say it all.
I wonder.
I wonder.
My theory was that the writing is maybe the most highest form, I guess, of expression, because it's really working with the elements of how we organize our thoughts through words. And it's also an art form that it has an interesting kind of elemental purity to it, because it's completely, like, you could theoretically write a book entirely in your head without any devices, any tools. Whereas a comic book or any visual art, at a certain point, I've got to like physically make this thing. So there is a kind of a craft element to visual art. So it a little bit, it gets away from that sort of purity of just the pure idea expressed in my mind that is then transferred to your mind,
Yeah. Yes.
So visual arts and comics even more. It's kind of a hybrid. It's very physical, I guess, and so it's a bit more messy, I guess. Yeah, it'll never be exactly
what you
there's
saw.
always a bit of element of surprise. Yeah, it's never
it won't be exactly what was in your mind. What comes out.
No.
What is put down. Yes.
Yeah, maybe that's why there's always slight sense of dissatisfaction at the end. Although sometimes it can be a nice surprise too. It's like, oh, I would have thought of that until it came out, So yeah,
I had one of those moments in our conversation. So, well, super. It was just such a pleasure talking with you, and I'm really honored by you spending this time talking about this together today. I would like to read what you wrote about beauty in your preface to close here today, Julian. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you to you. Yeah, it was really fun. I think, as I said, I'm kind of like, I really welcome this opportunity to speak with someone that isn't necessarily sold on comics to begin with, because it kind of forces me to challenge some of those givens, like to think about, well, why do I like comics, or why do I think they work, or what are their strengths and weaknesses? It's really a valuable opportunity. So thanks so much.
I have to tell you, I have a commission for you. I want you to illustrate God's Grandeur by Gerard Manley Hopkins.
Oh, wow. I love Gerard Manley Hopkins. Yeah. So that would be, well, I did in fact illustrate one of his poems in this in the collection.
Yes. Spring and Fall. Yes. So I've named the podcast Bright Wings because of that poem by Hopkins.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't realize that.
It's the last line of the poem.
Right. Yeah, no, Hopkins, I think he's such a visually compelling. And so, like, I don't know, I feel like he's one of those poets that really like takes your mind along for the ride when you're all these images, all the sort of almost a kaleidoscope of different perspectives that you're going through, and to try to capture some of that visually would really fun challenge.
Yes. Julian, this has been a remarkable conversation, and what has stood out to me most is your love for beauty. I want to conclude with something that you wrote in the last paragraph of your preface. You talk about, as much as it's possible to use what you did for educational purposes, you didn't create these images for use. You created them out of love for beauty. And you write that if we hear a beautiful piece of music, we wish we could somehow live inside of it. If we see a beautiful stranger, we wish we had the courage to go up and say hello. If we come upon a beautiful view, you basically say, we want to be a part of it. We want at least our picture taken in the beauty.
I was thinking of selfies.
Yeah. And though in the end, we can never quite hold on to the beauty in the way it seems to call upon us to do so, that will never stop human beings from trying. So I just wanted to thank you, Julian, for creating this beauty and helping us to see more, to see something of what you see when you read these poems.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for joining this conversation with Julian Peters and me. It renewed hope in me that people who disagree with one another, perhaps, can still share so much in common, so much that they love. Additionally, I want to encourage you to go seek out an essay that I've written on the blog of the Bright Wings website. In it, I beg a few questions, both of myself and of the comic genre in general. In it, I beg a few questions. Perhaps our problem in the 21st century is not literacy. Perhaps our problem is depth. I also wonder about how Instagram is shaping our sense of beauty. I wonder about our experience of deep reading and that as an immersive experience. I thank you so much for listening and for living thoughtfully with your children.